Hello there, welcome back. We're going to do probably the final FRQ in this series because it's the night before the exam, and I guess the interest in doing AP CSA questions will diminish after tonight, but hey, there's always the future because the internet is forever. So this video is going to be about the Crossword FRQ, a slightly challenging question. I think it's probably going to use all of our 20 minutes, but this is going to use our knowledge of 2D arrays. It's going to use our knowledge of traversal of 2D arrays, and in this case, it's going to be row major order. I try and do these FRQs, pretty fresh, so I try not to look at them too much. So I'm sort of looking through it as you're looking through it. But in the last video, I made a mistake right at the end, where I think I got the logic slightly wrong, so I may have lost a point. So I want to come back and do a proper one. So I know a little bit about this now because I've already written it out, but let's go through it, and hopefully this will give you some extra help if you're studying this right before your exam to get some clues on how to solve these. As I say with all of these, the main thing is to read the question really carefully. Time in FRQs is meant for reading. A lot of that time is meant for reading and understanding. So don't worry if you're spending time reading to understand. Also, I recommend taking notes. So when you're going through, write some notes on your paper, as the important stuff will jump out at you. All right, so with that said, let's jump in and take a look at what this question's asking for. So here we have a crossword puzzle grid, right, which is a two-dimensional rectangular array. Okay, so now I've written all this here. This is only this stuff here is actually just from the question. As you can see here, this is just the stuff. I've taken out the comments here and the preconditions. Okay, they're important, but I've just taken them out for simplicity. So I've not written anything there. I'm going to just take information from here and start to apply it into my notes. All right, so a crossword looks like this, and you can see everyone's seen a crossword before. Let's take a look at what the crossword looks like. We notice that there's black squares and white squares, obviously, and some of the white squares have numbers. Right? You'll see that all of the ones along the top row and along the outside edge have numbers, but some of them don't. And there's going to be certain rules, but we're jumping ahead a little bit. So let's see. Okay, some of the white squares are labeled with a positive number according to the rules. Okay, so the rule is we're going to get a positive number based on this rule. A square is labeled with a positive number if and only if the square is white. Okay, so big condition, the square is white. And the second condition is the square does not have a white space immediately above it, or it does not have a white square immediately to its left, or both. Okay, so this is an interesting statement. This is it looks like an or statement here, if you notice. It's either the square doesn't have a white space above it, or it doesn't have a white square to its left, or both. So here that explains the top row. All of them have numbers because they don't have a white square above it. So these conditions don't need to be both true, just one of them needs to be true. So that's an or statement, which is, they can both be true if they wanted to, but with ors, either side could be true for it to be true. So, okay, so that's the criteria, and I want to kind of note that down now. We'll maybe come back to that a little bit to see where it's going to go. Okay, so the squares are labeled with consecutive numbers in row major order. So here's your little other clue here, row major order, starting at 1. Okay, so we're going to have a numbering system starting at 1. And now let's look at the classes. Okay, so we're given a class. Now, quite often with these questions, you're going to be given a class with not much information in it, or a very simple class, and you're going to use that class as an array in the array. So it's basically going to be an array of these classes. And in this case, we've got Crossword here is basically a 2D array of squares, right? And it's using this square class. So we've got objects of square type called puzzle in a 2D array. And here we have the constructor of that, and we have one method. And our job is to write the method and also the constructor. Part A is the method and part B is the constructor. Right, now let's take a quick look at square as well while we're here. Square, we're given the constructor and we're not really seeing anything else, so we don't need anything else. But the constructor is basically the instructions on how to make an object from this class. And square, as you see here, it takes a Boolean is black and a number. And the Boolean is black, right? So a square is black if and only is black is true. Okay, so that's defining when we're making a square, we're going to tell that square is it going to be black or not. And then the number probably is to do with the number on the square, right? This kind of number here. Now, what if it doesn't have a number? Does it say? Doesn't say yet. All right, so let's have a look at what we're being asked to do. Write the crossword method to be labeled. The method returns true if the square indexed by row R, column C, in a crossword puzzle grid should be labeled with a positive number. So we're going to determine, this is saying to be labeled, and it's returning a Boolean, if you notice, a true or false. Does this square need to be labeled? Okay, so what we're really doing in this question is we're working out, we're going to take the rules here that they've given us earlier. These are conditions, and we're going to put that in some kind of if-else statement to determine the rules, and we're going to return true or false depending on whether we got the rules right or not. Okay, so the method returns true if the square should be labeled with a positive number, otherwise it returns false. The parameter black squares indicates which squares in the crossword puzzle grid are black. Okay, so we've got black squares. Now where is that black squares? Alright, so the input here that we're given is actually an input of the black squares. And you'll notice here that the constructor of crossword is actually given the input of black squares too. So this must be perhaps saved in a variable up here as well. Like we've got the puzzle, the crossword puzzle, but then we've also got this black squares variable, or grid. All right, so black squares seems to contain just true or false values to say if what's black and what's not. Okay, so if it's true, it means it's a black square. So we can use that to reference and see if the square is black, and we know that by the rule, if the square is black, I think it's time to start putting the rules in here actually. So if the square is black, well, we're going to return false, right? Because it won't need to be labeled. And so else, and I would imagine we're fitting lots into this else statement here. So I'm actually kind of getting into code already. So let's just put that in here. If square is black, and this is my condition. I'm kind of writing half code and half not code. But this is sort of like pseudocode / real code. But I'm getting an idea for what it's asking here. So we know that if the square is black, we're going to return false. And else. Now we have some conditions for the else, and we have to go and enshrine these conditions in our logic. So here are the conditions we need to enshrine here. The square does not have a white square above it, or does not have a white square to its left. Okay, so you got to be a little bit careful, like reading this kind of logic. It's getting a positive number if it doesn't have a white square above it, or it doesn't have a white square to its left. So clearly, again, we're not saying and, we're saying or. So this is the case where we might be able to return true, right? Because if we see that we don't have a white square above it, we can say, oh, that meets this condition. Then we can check and see if it meets this condition and return true. So there's a couple of conditions where we can return true, and then if not, we can return false. All right, so let's put this condition in here and start to put these two conditions in. So if white square above, if no white square above, then we can return true. If no white square to the left, return true. Now, it would be easily possible to put these together into an or. I could probably use an or statement here like that. That would be another way to go about it. But for now, I just want to keep them a little bit separate. I think it's fine to keep these two things separate because they're kind of different conditions. So my rules are as such. I'm just going to keep them very separated. Okay, and just so you can keep remembering which one is which, no white square above and no white square to the left. Okay, and if we get to the end of this and we haven't returned true here, then we're going to know that we've missed all the conditions and therefore we can return false. And that would complete the method. Right, so we have some work to do still. Let's first work out this part, like if square is black. How do we work out if square is black? Well, we're given this lovely Boolean grid, black squares. So it should be easy to put R and C, the row and the column, into these coordinates in the grid. And if it comes back true, we know it's black. So it's pretty easy actually. We just put in black squares. R, C. And nothing more needs to go in there. Some people write equals true, but that's is kind of redundant. Meaning I don't need to put it in there because it's black squares is already Boolean. Okay? It's like saying if true equals true. No need. If this comes out to be false, the whole if statement will be false, okay, and it won't run. So this is really just a true or false here anyway. So I just put black squares coordinates in there for the R and C in the input. Okay, so I'm taking that, putting it in there. Is it a black square? Okay, yes or no? All right. Okay, so the next part, I need to convert this to do a check, the white square above. And in this case, I'm looking above me in the crossword. So let's take a look, where's my crossword? Okay, so let's work with a number here. Let's just work with the number 10. All right, so let's just imagine that the R and the C is coming in, is giving us this coordinate here. Now remember, the rows are across here, columns are down there, okay? And as we process this grid, and remember a 2D array is basically an array of arrays. So as we access each one of these, it's an array of columns. So when we access row 1, so black square is 1, would contain, black square 0 would be true, false, false, true, 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 false, 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 right? So you can see there that this is going to give us the details, right? So what we're going to do is trying to find out if the one above, right, is white. And so this is basically saying if it's no white square above, it means that it's black, right? So, or what if it's row 0? Well, then if it's row 0, then we can exit straight away because there's nothing above here. So let's start with that. If R equals 0, then we can say already return true. Okay, so that's already, we can return true. If we see that R is 0, just return 2 straight away. Or there's another condition. So if there's no white square above, meaning that the row above is black. So how do we find the row above? Well, we just take the R value and -1. Keep the same column value. So if black squares, and let's go R -1 and C. So same column. If this comes back true, because it's a black square, then we'll know that there is no white above, such as 13, right? We'd come back with a black square above because we -1 from the row. Now you're saying, okay, teacher, what if we're at row 0? Won't this go and access a part of the array that's no longer there? It won't, because we've already put R equals 0 here. Once Java sees this on this side, it automatically just quits, because when you have an OR statement, if either side of the OR is true, the whole thing's true, and it'll process this one first, and it won't even check this one. So we don't need to nest this R equals 0 within another statement. That's perfectly okay to write it like this. We put the R equals 0 first, and then it won't even get here if R is 0. Okay. So let's do the same thing with the square to the left, except that one, we should check if the column is 0. If the column is 0, then we can do the same thing. So if C equals 0, or, and now I'm going to check the black squares, but instead of checking to the above, I need to check the left. So this will be C -1. Keep R the same. Black squares are the same, and C -1. So that'll be checking the column before, right? So here we check the column before, right? Minus C, so C is -1, and R stays the same. So we're really just using these black squares to get an idea of like what's around the squares. Okay, so we're just moving in grid fashion, up or down, and that would give us the logic. I think we're good for that one. That seems to be going well. Now, I did take a little bit of time with that. Probably wanted to take a little bit less time, but I just wanted to talk through it so you're pretty clear about how it works. All right, so we move on. Part B. Now we're going to write the constructor for this crossword. So you'll notice that in constructors, obviously we've got a puzzle up here. It's declared. So this is the declaration of a instance variable, right? The declaration is basically saying I have a new variable which is going to point to a 2D array of squares. Okay, so that's basically all it's doing. There is no array of squares yet at this point. It's just a pointer. It's a declaration. What we need to be doing is initializing this puzzle, right? So usually what the purpose of a constructor is to initialize the instance variables, and then also maybe set up any of the logic that needs to go as part of the object. Now with a crossword, I guess we're going to have to start to create a bunch of squares, because this is a grid of squares, and we're going to need to start to create those squares and give them numbers and all that stuff. So let's start with initializing this puzzle. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we just say puzzle. Let's point it to an actual, let's create that thing. So we say new square, do the, okay. But now what we need is the numbers of how big is this 2D array going to be? And how do we find that out? Okay, so we should have the same dimensions as the parameter, black squares. Okay, so how am I going to find out how many rows? Well, the rows part is easy. The rows comes here, the first column, and so that's just basically how many in the first, so black squares, how many rows does it have? We say dot length here. Now, to find out the columns, we need to look inside the rows, because the columns exist inside the row. And so we have to look inside the column, and to do that we're going to look inside just the first column. Okay, so we'll say black squares 0, and then find the length of that, right? So we're looking inside the first, we're taking the first row and saying, what's your length? Or how many columns inside? So that would give us the length of the columns, right? How many columns there are. So that's to find our new 2D array of the puzzle, okay? And it's assigned it to the puzzle variable. Okay, so initialize, okay, the crossword puzzle. Next step. All right, so let's see what else we're going to do. Okay, each element of the puzzle grid should be initialized with a reference to a square object with the appropriate color and number. All right, so the number is positive if the square is labeled, and 0 if the square is not labeled. So here's where we're going to start using our method that we wrote before. This is really common in the these FRQs. You may have noticed is that you'll be asked to use what you've done in part A. I'm going to shrink this up because we don't need to pay attention to how it works. All we need to figure out is that it's going to give us a Boolean if we give it an R, a C, and the black squares array. Okay, so that's how we use this method. So it's pretty easy. We just chuck the values in there, and we'll get the Boolean result. Does it need a label? Yes or no? Okay, so one thing we've got to do now is to go through our crossword puzzle and start to add numbers, right? So we'll make a square, we'll make it black or white, we'll give it a number, and we'll be increasing those numbers as we go. Okay, so I'm going to make a new variable here called int label, and we're going to start it off at 1. That's going to keep track of the label. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty good. I think we've got, yeah, I think that's fine. And let's do some just rechecking of the question. The number is positive if the square is labeled, and 0 if the square is not labeled. Okay, so now we need to go through our grid, and we need to do this in, if you remember from before, it's in row major order. It said it in the question actually, but I think we can just see that it's going, the numbers are going across like this, so that's row major order. Okay, just like that. If it was going down like this, that would be column major order. But we got row major order going on here. So row major order, like this, we're going to be doing the outer loop is the rows. All right, so keep the R and the C, R less than, and let's use our puzzle dot length R plus plus. And then the second loop, the inner loop, is for the columns. And just like we did with the black squares up top, we're going to take the first row of puzzle to find the length of that row to get an idea of how many times we need to loop through for all the columns, and see, oh gee, I did R, that's a mistake. Okay, and C++. Alright, so that's our basic row major order loop. You should recognize this by now. Row major order loop. So for each little element here, you know, I made a 2D array of squares, but I haven't made the square for each one. So what I need to do is to be using the constructor to construct that square. Okay, so it's kind of curious because, you know, you say, well, you made the array here, right? Didn't you make the squares there? No, you made a bunch of pointers to squares. So I've got a pointer to a 2D array, and those 2D arrays are basically pointers to some place, right? So it's saying, okay, we're going to point to this place, which is a square object. So it's another level deep, but these squares need to be initialized and created. So I'm going to create a square. Okay, I need to give it, is it black? And give it a number. So the question is, does it need to be numbered? And so that I'm going to use my to be labeled here to figure that out. First up, I can work out is it black, right? And so I think, let's see the logic of this. I'm going to type it out. So if it's black, or to be labeled is false, right? So if it's not to be labeled, then I can just give it the number 0. Right, so the number should be 0, and then I'm going to create so num will equal 0, and let me say then well, actually I'll just create it here. Okay, so let's just say puzzle RC equals new square, and then we're going to use false. Oh, sorry, so true. It is. Wait, hang on. That's not black. Okay, so let's take this away. We can only use that. Okay, and so if it's black, it's true, and the number can be 0 there for, right? A black square gets a 0. So if it's black, I deal with that case first. Okay, that's out of the way. Okay, now, so if it's not, let's deal with that. So the question is it to be labeled? If it is to be labeled, we need to use the label. If not, we'll just do the regular way. So if to be labeled, and use the R, use the C, and use the black squares array. Okay, it's just called black squares, so that's enough. So I've used it correctly, and it's going to evaluate to true or false. So if this is true, it needs to be labeled, then I'm going to create that puzzle, and puzzle RC equals new square, and it's not black, right? False, and the label can be labeled, and I should update that label to increase afterwards. If it's not to be labeled, then we can just say else puzzle C equals new square, false, not a black square, and 0. It doesn't get a label, it gets a 0. So my logic, fairly sound. I mean, it's it took a little more logic. I mean, I did have to write this statement out 3 times, which I don't particularly like. I'd rather set up these variables, the true, the false, and the label first, and then just have one statement of making that. But just to make it very clear that we've got a situation here of black or not black, and then there's 2 conditions of not black, if it's labeled or not labeled. That makes it very easy, I think. Okay, so that goes through this loop, and it sets up all of these squares, and I think that concludes what we needed to do. That seems to be right. And it says here, you can assume that what you did in part A works. Don't need to worry about that. So even if you use it and it wasn't quite right, as long as you're using it as it's intended, as in you got to use the right signature and the return value, as long as you do that, that should be fine, right? That's what the statement means, right? Okay, and so that is the final answer. It took a little longer than I wanted, but I did go a little bit slower this time to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. But that's it. So some general tips with this stuff is don't let it confuse you. Just work through methodically. This is a longer question. This took me longer to explain than other FRQs that I've done, and so hopefully you would make up the time that you could make this up sort of on the other easier questions. As you get better at this stuff, you'll start to recognize these problems, and just really, in an exam situation, you want to be as clear as you can for your sake, not for the marker's sake, but for your sake. Be pretty clear that what you're doing, just lay it out really easy for yourself. Use notes, make your loops simple. Don't try and shove everything into an if statement. Like I could have shoved in, black and or something. That would have just been super confusing for me, and it would have been harder to think through the problem. In an exam, you're stressed. You don't want to be trying to do some complicated stuff. Just make it very easy, make it very clear. It could be more efficient, yes. And there's many ways to make this shorter code, but I think it's better in an exam just to write it out just as written in the question. I think that's a recipe for success. And speaking of success, I hope you have all the success in the exam coming up very shortly, or if you're listening to this in the future, whenever your exam is coming. Practice makes perfect. Okay, so catch you next time.